The revolutionary ideals of the American colonists motivated them and contributed to their victory against the British. A decade later, an ideal would inspire another army, the greatest revolutionary army the world had seen, the Republican Army of France. Paris, 1789. A mob of angry, hungry Parisians storms the royal prison, the Bastille. It's the first act of violence in a revolution that will sweep away 1,000 years of rule by kings. Like the American Revolution, the French Revolution would have a radical effect on war and civilization. The Americans' goal was simple: to throw out the British and govern themselves. The French Revolution sought to change an old society from top to bottom. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the name of these high ideals, thousands of French aristocrats met their deaths at the hands of a mob or the blade of the guillotine. As the revolution changed the face of France, it changed the face of the French army. In 1789, 85% of army officers were aristocrats. 5 years later, the guillotine and exile had reduced that to 3%. With powerful enemies outside France, the new republic needed an army and needed it quickly. In 1791, the republic trained 100,000 volunteer citizens and turned them into an army. In 1792, more volunteers joined up. But the Republic needed even more men because it was fighting Prussia, Austria, and Holland. The French revolutionary government called an entire nation to arms. For the first time in history, every able-bodied citizen was called to fight for the country.
Young men will go to battle. Married men will forge arms and transport supplies. Women will make tents, uniforms, and serve in hospitals. Children will pick rags. Old men will have themselves carried to public squares to inspire the courage of the warriors and to preach the hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic.
By the summer of 1794, 1 million men from every social class, from every occupation, from every part of France had joined the army of the French Revolution. It was the largest European army ever assembled. To inspire this huge army with military fervor, the government distributed millions of copies of official bulletins, radical newspapers, and patriotic songs. Not only was the revolution to be protected in France, it was to be exported. People everywhere would be free from the yoke of monarchy and aristocracy. The French soldiers thought of themselves as liberators, not conquerors. The idea begun by the French in the 1790s would reach its full potential in the vast armies and universal conscription of World War I. In France, men willingly served in the army because the state made them citizens. By World War I, this idea was universally accepted, and every able-bodied male citizen was called to arms. The French army was now based firmly on the notion of equality. Soldiers could rise through the ranks by their talent and ability, rather than social class. This meant that the best soldiers became officers, giving the French army the advantage over opponents who considered aristocratic birth an officer's main qualification. The most talented of them was a young Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. His success on the battlefield was phenomenal. And in 1804, at the age of 35, he proclaimed himself Emperor of France.
Napoleon had a Roman relentlessness and ruthlessness. He was, in a way, a reincarnation of Rome 1,000 years or more after the empire had died. He benefited from the transformation of France into a war-making state immediately after the Revolution. The Revolution turned France into a war-making state.
In Napoleon, the post-revolutionary army found a military genius. Although Napoleon's army was no longer a revolutionary force, it was still an army of Frenchmen, sons of their nation and inspired by their leader. Napoleon continued to promote the best men, regardless of birth. Of his 26 most senior officers before 1789, 4 were sergeants, 3 were privates, and 1 was a bandsman. One of these, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, ended his career as King of Sweden. Radical new officers created radical new ways of running an army. In 1792, the Revolutionary Army created the first combat division, a miniature army of a few thousand men. It combined infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and could operate independently or with other divisions. The divisional system is used today in the U.S. Army and Marines. Napoleon perfected the system. He subdivided his army into individual corps, each with its own commander and responsibility. This is how Napoleon was able to move huge armies quickly. Jean-Pierre Blaise, a corps officer, made a lightning march from the northern coast of France across Europe to Vienna and Austerlitz in 1805.
We were ordered to leave all unnecessary possessions at the depot, so we would be burdened with as little as possible. The rapidity of our march did not permit food supplies to follow us, but we were able to do without bread because we were in the midst of the best season for potatoes in a country where they are very good. How many times did we ruin the villagers' hopes? We stole the product of a year's work.
The speed and foraging skills of Jean-Pierre and his comrades allowed Napoleon to march 500 miles in 5 weeks. Arriving in the east with unexpected speed, Napoleon took the Austrians and the Russians by surprise, easily capturing Vienna and Austerlitz. By the end of 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of the European mainland. But he wasn't master of the sea. His opponent was the British Admiral Horatio Nelson. Like Napoleon, Nelson was a man whose daring and skill won him rapid promotion through the ranks. Throughout 1805, Nelson chased the French fleet, finally bringing them to battle on October 21st near Cape Trafalgar. Nelson ignored the tradition of drawing alongside enemy ships to exchange broadsides. He invented a new tactic, the melee, giving his captains free rein among the French ships. In the mayhem that followed, the superior captain secured British victory. But Nelson was killed, shot by a French sniper at his moment of triumph over the French Navy. Napoleon continued to be master of land until he decided to invade Russia. The Russian campaign of 1812 ended in disaster when winter set in. Napoleon's army suffered 300,000 casualties. Most froze or starved to death. But Napoleon Bonaparte would not be finished off easily. He'd already fought more battles and won more victories than Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar combined. Though he lost the Russian campaign, he would be back. March 1815. Napoleon was determined to conquer Europe. Only Britain and her allies, Prussia and Austria, could stop him. The battle would take place here at Waterloo, now in Belgium. Waterloo was a huge battle, involving 190,000 men. Yet the battlefield itself was tiny, only 1 square mile. At each end were fortified farmhouses. On one side, Le Haisson. On the other, Hougoumont. Both would prove crucial in the battle. The two armies were exhausted. For days there had been vicious skirmishing.
They'd had very little sleep the night before, and perhaps not the night before that either. They'd both marched quite a long distance. The night of June the 17th, 18th was awful, pouring rain, and they'd all got up wet because they'd slept in the open.
For the French, Napoleon's presence was the best cure for aching limbs and the greatest inspiration to fight. Napoleon was anxious to start the battle. He knew that Britain's 50,000 Prussian allies had not arrived. Without them, the two armies were equally matched, with about 70,000 men each. But Napoleon was waiting for a heavy overnight rain to drain from the battlefield to give his horses a better chance. The crack French cavalry exercised their horses, waiting for their call to action. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, was waiting too. He wanted Napoleon to make the first move. Just before 11 in the morning, French infantry began to form their lines. The French artillerymen primed their guns. Napoleon was ready. 246 French cannon started the bombardment.
But Wellington had made his men lie down. Most of the French cannonballs went over the top. Unfortunately, in some places, there wasn't cover. One British battalion in particular, the 27th, were exposed to artillery fire for an hour or more. And when they marched away at the end, they left behind them a square of their own dead and wounded.
At the same time, fighting began at the buildings on both ends of the battlefield. One of these was Hougoumont, the fortified farmhouse held by the British.
The French came forward to try and break into Hougoumont, and so crumble the right-hand end of Wellington's line, which would have desperately weakened his position. So a terrible, bitter little battle took place actually inside Hougoumont, intensely hand-to-hand. The French actually broke down the great farmyard door. A giant of a Frenchman, known to history as l'enfonceur, the man who broke in, actually got through. But the British managed to close the door behind him. They then raced round the courtyard, chasing the French, chasing them upstairs into attics. They were pinned into small, confined spaces and skewered to death. They killed every single French soldier who got into the courtyard, except there was a little drummer boy whose life was spared.
When Napoleon thought his artillery had softened up Wellington's line sufficiently, he sent in his cavalry. They charged into the valley and up the little slope toward the crest where the British were standing.
Wellington then made his men stand up. And of course they formed square. That's to say there was a front, two sides, and a back to each of the battalion formations. This was the way infantry were trained to stand when they were charged by cavalry. They were also trained not to shoot until the cavalry were within killing range, and that meant only 50 yards perhaps, a terrible test of the nerves of the soldiers as they saw this mass of horses bearing down on them.
One officer described the sound of musket balls striking the breastplates of French cavalry as like hailstones beating on glass.
These were disciplined soldiers, and they did hold their fire, and once they held their fire, it was the cavalry who were scattered, not the infantry, because horses will not ride into massed musketry fire. They won't ride onto bayonets. So the cavalry fanned out, went round the sides of the squares, passed out into the back area of the Allied line, and then reformed and galloped back again. This was the pattern of the battle during the afternoon. Some of the British squares were charged 12 times, fired 12 times, and survived 12 times. None of the British squares was broken by cavalry on the day of Waterloo.
Napoleon saw that his artillery and cavalry assaults hadn't worked. It was time to send in his elite infantry, the Imperial Guard.
This was the decisive moment of the battle. Wellington galloped to the point, stood behind his troops, waited, suddenly judged the moment when the French would be in range. The officers took the range, gave the order, a huge blast of musketry crashed out. The head of the French column reeled, shook, and began to fall back. And indeed, curiously, it was the French guardsmen at the back of the column who began to run away first. They'd sensed that the moment of decision had come and had passed. It had passed to the favor of the British. They were defeated. And Wellington said to one of his commanders, "Go on, Coburn, they won't stand." Standing was crucial to the rhythm and dynamics of a gunpowder battle. So the British infantry began to move forward, to follow them, to fire volleys into the retreating enemy. Wellington followed them on his horse, riding across the indescribable carnage of the battlefield, where men and horses lay dead in thousands, 10,000 dead horses on the battlefield, 40,000 dead and wounded men. There was a night of unimaginable, unspeakable suffering, when the battlefield was loud with the cries of dying and wounded men and animals. There'd been looting. People had crept out onto the battlefield to strip the dead of their possessions, and certainly in some cases to kill the wounded who protested at being looted. That took place. The work of rescue itself certainly didn't begin until daylight, and then had to go on for 2 and 3 days. Some of the wounded of Waterloo were not brought to first aid until the 3rd day after the battle. And of course, a vast number of the wounded had died of shock and of thirst. So many of the thousands of dead of Waterloo died after the battle, not during the battle.
4 days after the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated as Emperor of France. The military genius who had stunned and terrified Europe for 2 decades spent his last years in exile. Napoleon manipulated the French Revolution to create a massive military force. But having command of the greatest army in the world was not enough to prevent his downfall.